Karen Thompson had always prided herself on being the gatekeeper of her quiet suburban neighborhood. As a member of the Homeowners Association, HOA board, and a self-appointed enforcer of community standards, she took it upon herself to ensure that everyone adhered to the rules, or at least her interpretation of them. Her house, with its perfectly manicured lawn and tastefully arranged flower beds, was a testament to her dedication. To Karen, maintaining the pristine image of the neighborhood wasn't just about appearances. It was about preserving what she saw as the right kind of order. That all changed when Marcus Reed moved in. Marcus was young, professional, and black, a combination that immediately set off alarm bells for Karen. She watched from behind her curtains as he unloaded boxes from a moving truck, his easy smile and friendly demeanor doing little to ease her discomfort. To Karen, Marcus represented everything she feared: change, disruption, and an unwelcome shift in the demographic balance of her carefully curated world. The first sign of trouble came during Marcus's second week in the neighborhood. It started. Innocently enough, Karen noticed that Marcus's trash cans were left out on the curb past the designated collection day. According to HOA regulations, bins should be removed promptly after pickup, but Karen decided this minor infraction warranted immediate action. She drafted a formal complaint to the HOA, citing not only the trash issue, but also vague concerns about noise levels and suspicious visitors. When Marcus received a letter from the HOA warning him about compliance issues, he was baffled. He hadn't done anything wrong, or so he thought. A quick review of the rules confirmed that he had indeed missed the deadline for retrieving his trash cans by one day, but the rest of the allegations seemed baseless. Still, he chalked it up to bureaucratic overreach and resolved to pay closer attention to the guidelines moving forward. But Karen wasn't satisfied. Over the next few weeks, her complaints multiplied. There was the time she reported seeing someone loitering near Marcus's driveway late at night, though no such person existed, and another instance where she claimed his music was too loud, despite the fact that he rarely played anything above a whisper. Each accusation brought another letter from the HOA, each one more accusatory than the last. Marcus tried to brush it off at first, attributing Karen's behavior to nosiness or perhaps a misunderstanding. But as the incidents piled up, he began to suspect something darker was at play. When he finally confronted Karen about her constant interference, her response only fueled his suspicions. "I'm just looking out for the neighborhood," she said coolly, her voice dripping with condescension. "Some people don't understand how important these rules are." It was then that Marcus realized Karen's hostility wasn't random. It was personal. And while he might have been tempted to let it go, there was something about her smug certainty that grated on his nerves. For the first time since moving in, Marcus considered taking action, not because he wanted to escalate things, but because he refused to be intimidated. Little did Karen know, Marcus Reed wasn't just any ordinary neighbor. Beneath his calm exterior lay a sharp mind and a wealth of experience navigating complex legal battles. What she perceived as weakness was actually strength, waiting patiently to strike back. As Marcus stood on his porch watching Karen retreat into her home with a triumphant smirk, he made a silent vow. This wouldn't end here. If Karen insisted on making his life difficult, he would make sure she regretted it, and so began a game of cat and mouse, one that neither participant fully understood yet, but both were determined to win. In the days that followed, Marcus continued to live his life as usual, ignoring Karen's increasingly frequent calls to the HOA and even the police. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down on her efforts, filing new complaints almost daily. She accused Marcus of parking illegally, hosting parties without permission, and even damaging public property, all fabrications designed to paint him as a problem resident. But Marcus wasn't fooled. With every false report, his resolve hardened. He knew Karen's true motives weren't rooted in concern for the neighborhood. They stemmed from something far uglier. And soon he would prove it. For now, though, he bided his time, gathering evidence of Karen's harassment while maintaining a facade of indifference. After all, the best way to defeat an opponent like Karen was to let her dig her own grave. And dig she did. Unbeknownst to Karen, Marcus had already begun laying the groundwork for retaliation. Using his connections as a real estate lawyer, he quietly acquired information about Karen's finances, her history with the HOA, and her interactions with other neighbors. What he discovered painted a picture of a woman consumed by prejudice and paranoia, someone who thrived on controlling others. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus prepared for the next phase of his plan. He knew it would require precision, patience, and a touch of creativity, but most importantly, it would demand courage, the kind of courage it takes to stand up to injustice, no matter how entrenched it may seem. Karen, however, remained oblivious to the storm brewing on her horizon. Confident in her ability to manipulate the system, she pressed forward, convinced that her campaign against Marcus would ultimately succeed. What she didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't just a target. He was a predator, and predators always strike when their prey least expects it. Marcus Reed sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by documents and notes spread out like a battlefield map. His laptop hummed softly as he scrolled through emails, cross-referencing dates, times, and incidents. Every complaint Karen had filed against him was meticulously documented, each one a piece of the puzzle that revealed her true intentions. What started as a vague suspicion had now solidified into undeniable evidence. Karen Thompson wasn't just a nuisance. She was a bigot using the guise of HOA regulations to harass him because of the color of his skin. But Marcus wasn't angry. Not yet. He felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that Karen's actions were leaving a paper trail, one that could be used against her if needed. As a real estate lawyer, he understood the power of documentation. It wasn't enough to simply believe someone was wrong. You had to prove it. And proving Karen's harassment would require more than just her words on paper. It would demand strategy, precision, and an unshakable resolve. Karen, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing next door. Her days were consumed with what she saw as her civic duty, protecting the neighborhood from undesirable elements. She spent hours poring over the HOA bylaws, searching for any infraction Marcus might have committed, or could be accused of committing. When none materialized, she fabricated them, confident that no one would question her motives. Her latest grievance involved Marcus's landscaping. According to Karen, the shrubs along his property line were growing too tall, encroaching on the shared space between their homes. Never mind that the plants were still well within acceptable limits, or that Marcus had planted them months ago without issue. To Karen, this was another opportunity to assert control. She drafted yet another complaint, attaching photos she'd taken from her window. In her mind, these images were irrefutable proof of Marcus's disregard for community standards. She sent the letter to the HOA board, copying Marcus himself to ensure he knew exactly how serious she was about maintaining order. When Marcus received the email, he couldn't help but chuckle. The accusation was so absurd it bordered on comical, but beneath his amusement lay a steely determination. Karen's relentless pursuit of him wasn't just inconvenient, it was exhausting, and it was time to take action. The first step in Marcus's plan involved gathering even more evidence. While Karen believed she was operating under the radar, her behavior left traces everywhere. Marcus installed a discreet security camera on his front porch, pointed toward Karen's driveway. If she continued her campaign of harassment, the footage would serve as indisputable proof of her misconduct. He also reached out to other neighbors, subtly probing for information about Karen's past interactions with them. At first, many were hesitant to speak up, fearing retaliation. But once they learned Marcus was a lawyer and that he intended to hold Karen accountable, they opened up. Stories poured out. Karen's obsessive monitoring of mailboxes, her insistence on enforcing arbitrary rules, her thinly veiled racism toward anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of neighbor. One elderly couple recounted how Karen had once threatened to report them to the HOA because their grandson, who was black, visited frequently. Another neighbor described being grilled by Karen after hosting a barbecue attended by a diverse group of friends. Each story added weight to Marcus's case, painting Karen as not just a bully, but a racist one at that. With his evidence mounting, Marcus turned his attention to legal avenues. He contacted a colleague specializing in discrimination law, explaining the situation and seeking advice. Together, they reviewed the complaints Karen had filed, analyzing whether they constituted harassment under state law. They concluded that while individual incidents might seem minor, the pattern of behavior clearly crossed legal boundaries. Armed with this insight, Marcus drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to Karen. It outlined her repeated attempts to intimidate him, cited relevant statutes prohibiting racial discrimination, and warned her that further harassment would result in legal consequences. Before sending it, however, Marcus decided to play one final card: confrontation. One evening, as Karen watered her flowers in full view of her front yard, Marcus approached her with calm confidence. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone polite but firm, "I've noticed you've been quite busy filing complaints about me. I appreciate your dedication to the neighborhood, but I wanted to clarify something. Are my actions really the problem here, or is it something else?" Karen stiffened, her watering can pausing mid-air. For a moment she seemed taken aback by Marcus's directness. Then her expression hardened. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Reed," she snapped, "but I'm simply doing my part to uphold the standards of this community." "Standards?" Marcus echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Or prejudices? Because, let's be honest, Mrs. Thompson, if I were white, would any of this matter?" Karen sputtered, unable to form a coherent response. Her face flushed red, and she stammered something about respecting the rules before retreating into her house. Marcus watched her go, feeling a flicker of triumph. He hadn't expected her to admit her bias outright, but he'd succeeded in rattling her. A small victory, perhaps, but significant nonetheless. That night, as Marcus reviewed his progress, he realized how far he'd come since moving into the neighborhood. Just weeks earlier, he'd been content to ignore Karen's antics, hoping they'd fade with time. Now he was actively dismantling her campaign of harassment, piece by painstaking piece. And though the road ahead promised challenges, Marcus welcomed them. After all, justice wasn't served by passivity, it required action. As he prepared to send the cease and desist letter the following morning, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. Karen might think she held all the cards, but she underestimated him. She underestimated the strength of truth, the power of preparation, and the resilience of those willing to fight back. For now, the game was still in its early stages. But Marcus knew one thing for certain: Karen's reign of terror wouldn't last much longer. The next morning, Karen awoke to find an envelope slipped under her door. Her heart raced as she picked it up, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possibilities. Had Marcus retaliated? Was this some kind of prank? She tore open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, her eyes scanning the formal language with growing unease. Cease and desist letter. The bold heading sent a shiver down her spine. Below it, the document outlined every false complaint she had filed against Marcus, accompanied by dates, times, and even screenshots of emails. It accused her of harassment, racial discrimination, and misuse of HOA authority. The tone was professional, but unyielding, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Marcus Reed was done playing games. Karen's hands trembled as she read further. The letter warned her that any future complaints or attempts to harass him would result in legal action. It cited specific laws protecting individuals from racial discrimination and harassment, along with penalties for violating those laws. Adieu. The bottom, Marcus's signature appeared in crisp black ink, followed by the contact information of his law firm, a subtle reminder that he wasn't bluffing. For a moment, Karen felt paralyzed. This couldn't be happening. How dare Marcus challenge her? She was the one enforcing the rules, keeping the neighborhood safe. He was the outsider, the disruptor. Yet here she was, caught red-handed, her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her. Marcus watched from his window as Karen stormed back inside her house after reading the letter. He hadn't expected her to roll over and apologize, not yet, but he knew the document had struck a nerve. The cease and desist letter wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. From now on, every move Karen made would be scrutinized, every word documented. If she continued her campaign of harassment, she'd have no choice but to face the consequences. But Marcus wasn't done. While the letter served as a powerful deterrent, he needed something more, a way to ensure Karen couldn't simply retreat into silence and bide her time. That's why he decided to escalate things further by reaching out to the HOA board. The HOA, though technically neutral, had unwittingly enabled Karen's behavior by accepting her complaints without question. Marcus suspected they were either unaware of her true motives or too afraid to confront her directly. Either way, it was time for them to take responsibility. He drafted a detailed email to the board attaching copies of the same evidence included in the cease and desist letter. In the message, he explained how Karen's actions had created a hostile environment for him and other residents. He urged the board to investigate her behavior and implement stricter guidelines to prevent similar incidents in the future. Most importantly, he requested that all future complaints involving him be reviewed thoroughly before being acted upon. Within hours, Marcus received a response from the HOA president, a middle-aged man named Robert, who prided himself on maintaining harmony within the community. Robert expressed concern about the allegations and promised to look into the matter. However, he also emphasized the importance of fairness, suggesting that both sides should present their cases at the next board meeting. This development pleased Marcus. A public forum would force Karen to defend her actions in front of her peers, exposing her hypocrisy and bias for everyone to see. Moreover, it gave him an opportunity to strengthen his case by presenting additional evidence. As the days passed, Karen grew increasingly agitated. The cease and desist letter weighed heavily on her mind, its implications sinking in with each passing hour. She tried to dismiss it as an empty threat, telling herself that Marcus wouldn't dare follow through. But deep down, she knew better. His calm demeanor and meticulous approach suggested someone who didn't make idle promises. Her frustration boiled over when she learned about the upcoming HOA meeting. The thought of facing Marcus, and potentially the entire neighborhood, in such a setting filled her with dread. She considered canceling her attendance altogether, claiming illness or prior commitments. But doing so would only confirm his accusations, making her appear guilty by default. Instead, Karen resolved to fight fire with fire. She spent the week gathering her own evidence against Marcus, scouring her files for anything that might discredit him. She dug up old photos of his trash cans left slightly beyond the curb, exaggerated stories about noise levels, and even fabricated concerns about structural damage to his property, which, of course, didn't exist. By the time the meeting arrived, she was armed with a binder full of documents, convinced that her preparation would save her reputation. On the night of the meeting, the community center buzzed with anticipation. Residents gathered in folding chairs, whispering among themselves as they waited for the proceedings to begin. When Marcus entered the room, dressed sharply in a navy blue suit, he exuded confidence. He nodded politely to those who greeted him, taking his seat near the front without hesitation. Karen, on the other hand, looked flustered. Her usually immaculate appearance seemed slightly off, her hair less styled, her blouse wrinkled, as if the stress of recent events had finally caught up with her. She sat rigidly in her chair, clutching her binder like a shield. Robert called the meeting to order, explaining the purpose of the gathering and inviting Marcus to speak first. Marcus rose slowly, addressing the group with measured words. He recounted his experiences with Karen, detailing her relentless campaign of harassment and the impact it had on his life. He presented screenshots of her emails, recordings of her phone calls, and testimonials from neighbors who had witnessed her behavior firsthand. When he finished, the room fell silent. Many residents exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsettled by what they'd heard. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, eager to hear Karen's response. It was Karen's turn to speak. Rising shakily to her feet, she launched into a passionate defense of her actions. She framed herself as a concerned citizen, dedicated to preserving the integrity of the neighborhood. She accused Marcus of exaggerating her complaints and twisting her words, portraying him as overly sensitive and unwilling to comply with basic rules. But as she spoke, cracks began to show in her argument. Her voice wavered when confronted with specific examples of her misconduct, and her explanations often contradicted the evidence Marcus had provided. Several attendees openly frowned, their skepticism evident. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted dramatically. Where once there had been uncertainty, there was now clarity. The HOA board announced that they would conduct a thorough investigation into Karen's behavior, suspending all complaints against Marcus until the matter was resolved. They also encouraged other residents to come forward with any relevant information. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus felt a sense of vindication. The meeting hadn't ended the conflict entirely, but it marked a turning point. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, he believed justice might prevail. Karen returned home that night feeling defeated. The meeting had exposed her for what she truly was, a bully hiding behind the guise of righteousness, and though she vowed to continue fighting, she knew the tide was turning against her. Marcus Reed wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was her nemesis, and she underestimated him at her peril. The days following the HOA meeting were tense for Karen. She spent most of her time holed up in her house, poring over emails and notes, trying to piece together a defense that could salvage her reputation. But every attempt felt futile. Marcus Reed had been thorough, too thorough. His documentation was meticulous, his arguments unassailable. And now, with the HOA board actively investigating her behavior, Karen found herself cornered like never before. Her anxiety only worsened when she received an official letter from the board requesting her presence at a private session to discuss the allegations against her. The tone of the letter was polite but firm, leaving no room for refusal. For Karen, this wasn't just about losing face. It was about losing control. Her carefully constructed image as the neighborhood's enforcer was unraveling thread by thread. Meanwhile, Marcus approached the investigation with calculated precision. He knew the outcome wouldn't hinge solely on the evidence he'd already presented. It would depend on how well he navigated the process moving forward. As a lawyer, he understood the importance of anticipating counterarguments and preparing for contingencies. So, while Karen scrambled to salvage her crumbling facade, Marcus methodically built his case further. Step 1. Strengthening the foundation. Marcus reached out to several neighbors who had expressed discomfort with Karen's behavior in the past. Some were hesitant to get involved, fearing retaliation, but Marcus reassured them, explaining that their testimonies could help bring about meaningful change. not just for him, but for the entire community. Slowly but surely, more residents came forward, sharing stories of Karen's overreach and bias. One neighbor, a single mother named Sarah, recounted how Karen had once reported her for letting her son play basketball in the driveway after dark. Another, a retired teacher named Mr. Jenkins, described how Karen had pressured the HOA to fine him for failing to trim his hedges, even though they were well within regulation limits. Each story added weight to Marcus's argument, painting Karen not just as a nuisance, but as someone who thrived on manipulating systems for personal gain. To ensure these accounts held legal merit, Marcus recorded interviews with each witness, obtaining signed statements where possible. He also cross-referenced their testimonies with any existing records or communications involving Karen, creating a comprehensive timeline of her actions. By the time the private session arrived, Marcus had compiled enough evidence to make even the most skeptical observer question Karen's integrity. Step 2. Leveraging legal expertise. Knowing the investigation might escalate into formal proceedings, Marcus consulted with his colleague Emma Carter, a civil rights attorney specializing in discrimination cases. Together, they reviewed the growing pile of evidence, identifying potential violations of state anti-discrimination laws. Emma advised Marcus to file a complaint with the local Human Rights Commission, if necessary, emphasizing that such a move could expedite resolution and increase pressure on Karen. Emma also suggested exploring the possibility of suing Karen individually for harassment. While this option carried risks, namely drawing out the conflict and potentially alienating other neighbors, it offered a powerful tool for holding Karen accountable. Marcus decided to keep it in reserve, using it as leverage only if negotiations failed. With Emma's guidance, Marcus drafted a concise summary of his findings, complete with citations of relevant statutes and precedents. This document would serve as both a roadmap for the HOA board and a blueprint for future legal action, if needed. Step 3. Preparing for confrontation. The private session took place in the small conference room of the community center, its sterile walls doing little to ease the palpable tension. Seated around the table were Robert, the HOA president, 2 other board members, Karen and Marcus. A tape recorder sat prominently in the center, ready to capture every word exchanged. Robert opened the meeting by reiterating the purpose: to examine the complaints filed against Marcus and determine whether Karen's actions constituted harassment or misuse of HOA authority. He then invited Marcus to present his case first. Marcus began calmly, laying out the facts in clear, concise terms. He summarized the pattern of false complaints, citing specific examples and referencing the supporting evidence he'd brought along. When he finished, he slid a copy of his summary across the table to the board members, ensuring they had all the details at their fingertips. Karen listened intently, her expression shifting between anger and unease. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into a passionate rebuttal, insisting that her actions were motivated purely by concern for the neighborhood. She accused Marcus of being overly sensitive and dismissed his witnesses as biased or unreliable, but her arguments lacked substance. When pressed to provide concrete evidence backing her claims, she faltered, resorting instead to vague generalizations and emotional appeals. The board members exchanged skeptical glances, clearly unimpressed by her performance. Step 4. Unveiling the truth. As the session wore on, Marcus introduced new evidence that caught Karen completely off guard. Using footage from his security camera, he demonstrated how Karen had repeatedly trespassed onto his property under the guise of inspecting alleged violations. One clip showed her peering through his window late at night. Another depicted her planting a noisy complaint. After seeing one of Marcus's friends, a black man, unload groceries from his car, these revelations struck a nerve. Even Robert, who had initially tried to remain neutral, couldn't ignore the implications. "Mrs. Thompson," he said finally, his voice tinged with disappointment. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable. If what Mr. Reed has shown us today is true, we may need to reconsider your role on the HOA board," Karen sputtered in protest, claiming the videos were taken out of context and accusing Marcus of entrapment. But her protests fell flat. The board members had seen enough to recognize a pattern of misconduct, one that extended far beyond Marcus himself. Step 5. Setting the stage for resolution. By the end of the session, the board made it clear that they intended to take decisive action. They announced plans to issue a formal reprimand to Karen, suspend her privileges as an HOA member, and implement stricter guidelines for handling complaints. Additionally, they proposed establishing a mediation committee to address disputes between neighbors in a fair and transparent manner. For Marcus, this was a significant victory. Not only had he succeeded in exposing Karen's harassment, but he had also prompted changes that would benefit the entire community. Yet he knew the battle wasn't over. Karen still clung to remnants of power, and her pride wouldn't allow her to accept defeat gracefully. As the meeting adjourned, Karen shot Marcus a venomous glare, her lips curling into a sneer. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him to hear. Marcus simply smiled. "Oh, I think it is," he replied coolly. Little did Karen know, Marcus had one final move planned, a move that would leave her with no choice but to retreat entirely. And this time, there would be no coming back. The days following the private session with the HOA board were a blur of tension and anticipation for both Marcus Reed and Karen Thompson. For Karen, the reprimand from the board stung deeply, chipping away at her carefully cultivated image as the neighborhood's guardian. She seethed in private, plotting her next move while outwardly pretending to accept the decision. Her mind raced with possibilities. How could she turn the tide back in her favor? Could she discredit Marcus further, or perhaps manipulate the system once again to regain her footing? But Marcus wasn't about to let her regain control. He had already anticipated her desperation and prepared accordingly. What Karen didn't realize was that this was only the beginning of his counteroffensive. Karen strikes back, or tries. To determine not to go down without a fight, Karen decided to escalate matters herself. She drafted another complaint, this time alleging that Marcus had violated zoning laws by installing an unauthorized structure in his backyard, a small garden shed he'd built months earlier. Though the shed complied perfectly with local regulations, Karen claimed it encroached on shared property lines and posed a safety hazard. She filed the complaint with the city council, hoping to bypass the HOA entirely and bring external scrutiny onto Marcus. It was a bold move, but one born out of desperation. If successful, it could cast doubt on Marcus's credibility and shift public opinion back in her favor. However, Marcus had foreseen such tactics. Before moving into the neighborhood, he had ensured all renovations and improvements to his property adhered strictly to local codes. He even kept detailed records of permits and inspections, just in case someone like Karen tried to weaponize bureaucracy against him. When the city inspector arrived unannounced, Marcus greeted them with a folder containing every document they might need. After a brief inspection, the official confirmed that the shed was fully compliant, leaving Karen's complaint baseless yet again. Frustrated and humiliated, Karen doubled down, filing additional complaints with other municipal departments. Everything from alleged noise violations to suspicions of illegal business operations, a claim so absurd it bordered on comical. But each attempt met the same fate. Thorough investigations revealed no wrongdoing on Marcus's part, and the officials grew increasingly irritated with Karen's relentless accusations. Marcus takes the offensive. While Karen flailed, Marcus continued, building his case against her. He knew that simply defending himself wouldn't be enough. To truly neutralize Karen's influence, he needed to strike directly at the source of her power, the trust she had cultivated within the community. To do this, Marcus launched a subtle campaign aimed at educating his neighbors about Karen's true nature. He started by organizing informal gatherings, inviting residents over for coffee or barbecues where they could discuss their experiences with Karen openly. At first, some attendees were wary, unsure whether speaking up would invite retaliation. But as more people shared their stories, a collective sense of solidarity began to emerge. One evening, during a particularly lively discussion, Sarah, the single mother, who had previously spoken out against Karen, revealed something shocking. Years ago, Karen had attempted to evict her elderly aunt from her home after falsely accusing her of violating HOA rules. The story sent ripples through the group, prompting others to recall similar incidents involving Karen targeting vulnerable residents. Inspired by these revelations, Marcus encouraged the group to compile their testimonies into a formal petition, addressed to the HOA board. The petition called for greater transparency in how complaints were handled and demanded stricter oversight of board members' conduct. Within days, dozens of signatures adorned the document, including those of several longtime residents who had never before questioned Karen's authority. When Marcus presented the petition to Robert, the HOA president, the reaction was immediate. Recognizing the growing unrest among the community, Robert agreed to reconvene the board and revisit Karen's role as a member. This time, however, the conversation would focus not just on her interactions with Marcus, but on her overall suitability for leadership positions within the HOA. The board meeting that changed everything. The subsequent meeting was unlike any other in the neighborhood's history. Dozens of residents packed the community center, eager to witness what many saw as a pivotal moment in their community's evolution. Karen sat stiffly at the table, her usual confidence replaced by nervous agitation. Across from her, Marcus exuded calm assurance, his preparation evident in every detail. Robert opened the proceedings by acknowledging the concerns raised in the petition. He then invited Marcus to speak, allowing him to present his findings in full. Marcus spoke clearly and concisely, weaving together evidence of Karen's harassment, manipulation, and misuse of power. He highlighted specific instances where Karen had exploited her position on the HOA board to target individuals based on race, age, or socioeconomic status. Next, several neighbors stepped forward to share their personal experiences with Karen. Some recounted being intimidated into silence when they dared to challenge her rulings. Others described feeling alienated or excluded because of her rigid adherence to outdated norms. Each testimony added weight to Marcus's argument, painting Karen as not just a problematic individual, but a symbol of systemic injustice within the HOA itself. By the time Marcus concluded his presentation, the mood in the room had shifted dramatically. Even longtime supporters of Karen looked visibly uncomfortable, unable to ignore the overwhelming evidence against her. When Robert asked for her response, Karen struggled to articulate a coherent defense. Her attempts to dismiss the allegations as exaggerations or misunderstandings fell flat, undermined by the sheer volume of corroborating evidence. A verdict is reached after hours of deliberation. The board announced its decision. In addition to formally reprimanding Karen for her misconduct, they voted unanimously to remove her from the HOA board. Furthermore, they established new guidelines, requiring impartial mediators to review all future complaints, ensuring fairness and accountability moving forward. For Marcus, this marked a major victory, not just for himself, but for the entire community. By exposing Karen's hypocrisy and dismantling her grip on power, he had paved the way for meaningful change. Yet he knew the work wasn't done. Karen remained a resident of the neighborhood, and her bitterness simmered beneath the surface. As the meeting adjourned, Karen shot Marcus one final glare, her jaw clenched tightly. "You think you've won," she whispered venomously, "but I'll be watching you." Marcus simply smiled. "I'm counting on it," he replied softly, knowing full well that Karen's downfall had only just begun. Karen Thompson wasn't one to accept defeat gracefully. Even as the HOA board dismantled her influence and stripped her of her position, she refused to let go of the resentment festering inside her. To Karen, Marcus Reed wasn't just a neighbor. He was an enemy who had humiliated her in front of the entire community, and enemies deserved retribution. In the days following the board meeting, Karen retreated into her home, nursing her anger and plotting her next move. She knew direct confrontation wouldn't work. Marcus was too prepared, too strategic. But what if she could strike from the shadows? What if she could find a way to undermine him without leaving fingerprints? Her mind raced with possibilities, each more devious than the last. Then it hit her, an idea so audacious it made her pulse quicken. If Marcus thought he'd won by exposing her, she would turn the tables on him. She would expose him. Karen spent hours poring over public records, searching for anything that might tarnish Marcus's pristine image. She dug into his professional background, hoping to uncover some scandal or misstep that could be used against him. When that yielded nothing, she turned her attention to his personal life. It was during this search that she stumbled upon something intriguing, a property transaction involving a house 2 streets over. The deed listed Marcus as the buyer, though the sale had been completed under a corporate entity rather than his name. Curious, Karen delved deeper, piecing together fragments of information until a pattern emerged. The house, it seemed, had been purchased shortly after Marcus moved into the neighborhood. Its location suggested it wasn't meant for personal use. It was too far away to serve as a convenient second home. Instead, Karen suspected it might be part of a business venture. Perhaps Marcus was flipping houses, engaging in real estate, speculation, or even laundering money through shell companies. Though she couldn't prove any wrongdoing, Karen saw an opportunity. If she could cast doubt on Marcus's integrity, she could erode the trust others placed in him. And if enough people began questioning his motives, his carefully constructed reputation might crumble. Armed with her findings, Karen crafted a series of anonymous letters addressed to various neighbors. Each letter contained snippets of information about the mysterious property, accompanied by leading questions designed to provoke suspicion. "Why is Marcus buying up homes in the area?" one asked. "What does he plan to do with them? Is he really here to live among us or to profit off our community?" She slipped the letters into mailboxes late at night, careful to avoid detection. Over the following weeks, whispers spread throughout the neighborhood. Some residents dismissed the claims as baseless rumors, but others weren't so sure. A few even approached Marcus directly, their curiosity tinged with unease. When Marcus first heard about the letters, he laughed them off. He knew better than to take anonymous accusations seriously. But as the questions persisted, he realized Karen had struck a nerve. Her strategy wasn't about proving guilt, it was about creating doubt. By planting seeds of uncertainty, she hoped to isolate him, turning the very community he sought to protect against him. Determined not to let Karen succeed, Marcus decided to confront the issue head-on. He invited several skeptical neighbors to his home for a candid discussion, offering to address their concerns openly and honestly. During the gathering, he explained the purpose behind the property purchase, revealing that it was part of a broader initiative aimed at revitalizing underserved areas of the neighborhood. "I bought that house," Marcus admitted, "because I believe in this community. I want to see it thrive, not just for those of us who already live here, but for future generations. That property will become a community center, offering resources like after-school programs, job training workshops, and support services for local families." His words resonated deeply with many attendees, especially those who had grown frustrated with the lack of opportunities available in their area. One resident, a single father named Jamal, expressed gratitude for Marcus's efforts, noting how such a project could benefit struggling households like his own. Another neighbor, Mrs. Patel, praised Marcus for thinking beyond individual interests and focusing on collective well-being. Encouraged by the positive response, Marcus announced plans to involve the community in the development process. He proposed forming a committee to oversee the project, ensuring transparency and accountability every step of the way. This move not only dispelled lingering doubts, but also strengthened ties between Marcus and his neighbors, reinforcing his role as a trusted advocate. Karen's desperation grows as word of Marcus's intentions spread. Karen watched helplessly as her carefully laid trap unraveled. Not only had he deflected her attacks, but he had transformed them into an opportunity to deepen his connection with the community. Her frustration boiled over, manifesting in increasingly erratic behavior. One evening, while Marcus worked in his garden, Karen appeared unannounced, her face flushed with anger. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she spat, her voice trembling. "Buying properties, playing savior, all while pretending to care about this neighborhood. Well, I know what you're really doing, Marcus. You're trying to control everything and everyone." Marcus raised an eyebrow, unfazed by her outburst. "Control?" he repeated calmly. "Or maybe I'm just trying to make things better. Unlike someone I know who seems content to tear people down instead of building them up." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but no words came. For once, she was speechless, her usual arsenal of insults and accusations rendered useless by Marcus's composure. Turning on her heel, she stormed back toward her house, muttering curses under her breath. A new front opens. Though Karen's latest attempt had failed, Marcus knew she wouldn't stop there. Her determination to undermine him was fueled by more than mere animosity. It stemmed from fear of losing control, fear of being exposed, fear of irrelevance. And as long as those fears drove her, she would continue fighting tooth and nail to reclaim her lost power. But Marcus was ready. With each new challenge, he grew stronger, his resolve sharpened by experience. He understood now that defeating Karen wasn't just about winning arguments or exposing her flaws. It was about reshaping the narrative of their community. By championing inclusivity, fairness, and collaboration, he was laying the foundation for lasting change. And when Karen inevitably struck again, he would be waiting with patience, precision, and a plan that would leave her with nowhere left to hide. Karen Thompson's desperation had reached a fever pitch. Her attempts to discredit Marcus Reed had backfired spectacularly, leaving her isolated and humiliated within the community she once controlled. Yet even as her influence waned, her hatred for Marcus only deepened. To her, this wasn't just about winning or losing. It was personal. It was existential. And if she couldn't beat him outright, she would destroy him in any way she could. Her opportunity came when an unexpected development shook the neighborhood. A major property developer announced plans to buy out several homes along the street, including Marcus's. The proposal promised modern renovations, increased property values, and a revitalized aesthetic, but at a cost. Many residents feared the influx of wealthier buyers would drive up prices, gentrify the area, and displace longtime families. For Karen, this was both a threat and an opportunity. She saw the potential chaos as a chance to exploit tensions between neighbors, turning them against Marcus and painting him as complicit in the destruction of their beloved community. If she played her cards right, she could not only undermine his credibility, but also ensure he lost everything he'd worked so hard to build. Karen began by targeting those most vulnerable to manipulation, the older residents who cherished the neighborhood's traditional charm and resented change. She knocked on doors late at night, whispering half-truths and spreading fear. "Did you know Marcus is working with the developers?" she asked one elderly couple over coffee. "He's been selling properties under the table, lining his pockets while we're forced out." When they pressed for proof, She deflected, claiming her sources were confidential, but urging them to trust her judgment. "Just look at how quickly he bought that other house," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the property 2 streets over. "What else would someone like him want with it except profit? He doesn't care about us. He never did." Her tactics proved effective. Within days, rumors swirled throughout the neighborhood, pitting long-time friends against each other. Some accused Marcus of betrayal, believing he had sold out for personal gain. Others remained skeptical, torn between loyalty to their new neighbor and concern for their futures. Marcus first learned of the backlash during a casual conversation with Mr. Jenkins, the retired teacher who had previously supported him. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Mr. Jenkins admitted reluctantly. "You've always seemed genuine, Marcus, but these stories, they're hard to ignore." Though hurt by the doubt, Marcus refused to let it derail him. He knew Karen was behind the smear campaign and vowed to expose her hand before the situation spiraled further out of control. To counter Karen's misinformation, Marcus decided to go public with the truth. He organized a town hall meeting, inviting all residents to attend and voice their concerns openly. The event took place in the community center, its fluorescent lights casting stark shadows across tense faces. When Marcus stood before the crowd, he exuded calm confidence, his words measured and deliberate. "I understand why some of you might feel uneasy about the proposed development," he began. "Change can be scary, especially when it threatens something as important as your home. But I want to assure you, I am not part of this project. In fact, I oppose it." Gasps rippled through the audience. Many hadn't expected such a bold declaration from Marcus, whose reputation as a real estate lawyer suggested he might benefit from the deal. "I purchased my home here because I believed in this community," Marcus continued, "and I intend to stay. As for the other property I own, it will remain exactly as I described, a resource for our neighborhood, not a tool for profit." He then turned his attention to Karen, addressing her directly for the first time in weeks. "You may have heard whispers linking me to the developers. Let me be clear, those claims are false. They were planted by someone who seeks to divide us, someone who thrives on fear and mistrust." The room fell silent, as Marcus's gaze locked onto Karen seated near the back. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her usual bravado faltering under the weight of scrutiny. "Karen Thompson has spent months harassing me, filing baseless complaints and attempting to tarnish my name," Marcus said evenly. "But her actions aren't just about me, they're about control. She wants to dictate how this neighborhood looks, feels, and functions. And if anyone dares challenge her vision, she tries to silence them." Several residents nodded in agreement, recalling their own experiences with Karen's authoritarian tendencies. For the first time, her manipulations were laid bare for everyone to see, not as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger pattern of behavior. Emboldened by the growing chorus of dissent, Marcus unveiled the final piece of his strategy: evidence of Karen's involvement in the rumor mill. Using surveillance footage from his security cameras, he demonstrated how she had visited multiple households after dark, often staying long enough to plant seeds of doubt. One clip showed Karen handing a letter to Mrs. Patel, a widow whose home lay directly in the path of the proposed development. Another captured her arguing heatedly with Jamal, the single father who had initially supported Marcus's community center initiative. Each moment served as a damning indictment of her tactics, forcing even her staunchest allies to reconsider their stance. As the meeting drew to a close, Robert, the HOA president, stepped forward to address the group. "We need to remember what brought us together in the first place," he said firmly. "This isn't just a collection of houses, it's a community. And communities thrive when we work together, not when we tear each other apart." His words resonated deeply, prompting murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Even Karen looked chastened, though her pride still burned brightly beneath the surface. In the aftermath of the town hall, tensions eased somewhat, but the scars of division lingered. While many residents rallied around Marcus, others remained, cautious, wary of aligning themselves too closely with either side. Karen, meanwhile, retreated into herself, nursing her wounds and plotting her next move. "This isn't over," he whispered, echoing Karen's earlier threat. But unlike her, he spoke without malice, only determination. He knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew one thing for certain. No matter what Karen threw at him, he would stand firm, because in the end, this wasn't just about him. It was about the future of the community and the people who called it home. In the weeks following the town hall meeting, a fragile peace settled over the neighborhood, but it was a peace built on shifting sands. While Marcus had successfully exposed Karen's manipulations and rallied many residents to his side, others remained caught in the crossfire of their escalating conflict. Some still clung to doubts about Marcus's intentions, swayed by Karen's whispered insinuations or simply unwilling to confront the truth. Others retreated into silence, too fearful of retaliation to take a stand either way. For Karen, this lingering uncertainty was both a lifeline and a weapon. Though her influence had waned significantly, she clung to the belief that if she could keep the community fractured long enough, cracks would inevitably form. And when they did, she'd be ready to exploit them. Her strategy shifted from direct confrontation to subtle sabotage, targeting not just Marcus, but the very fabric of trust holding the neighborhood together. Karen's first move came during a routine HOA meeting where she proposed an amendment to the association's bylaws. Under the guise of promoting transparency, she suggested implementing stricter guidelines for property improvements, requiring homeowners to submit detailed plans and obtain approval before making any changes. On the surface, the proposal seemed reasonable, even beneficial, but its true purpose was far more insidious. By complicating the process of maintaining homes, Karen hoped to create unnecessary burdens for residents, particularly those less familiar with bureaucratic procedures. She knew firsthand how frustrating such red tape could be, having used similar tactics herself in the past. And if the new rules caused friction among neighbors, so much the better. It would only deepen the divisions she sought to exploit. Marcus saw through the ruse immediately. Rising to speak during the discussion, he pointed out the impracticality of Karen's proposal, arguing that it would stifle creativity and discourage investment in the neighborhood. "We should be encouraging people to improve their properties," he said firmly, "not creating obstacles that make it harder for them to do so." His arguments resonated with many attendees, including Robert, who ultimately rejected the amendment. But Karen wasn't discouraged. Rejection only fueled her resolve. If she couldn't change the rules, she decided she would find other ways to sow discord. Over the following days, Karen intensified her efforts to pit residents against one another. She approached Sarah, the single mother who had previously spoken out against her, feigning concern about the rising cost of living in the neighborhood. "I hear the developers are offering buyouts," she said casually, her tone dripping with implication. "Maybe you should consider taking them up on it. After all, places like yours aren't exactly fitting in anymore." Sarah bristled at the suggestion, recognizing it for what it was, an attempt to drive a wedge between her and her neighbors. But Karen didn't stop there. She repeated similar comments to others, preying on insecurities and fears until even longtime friends began questioning each other's loyalty. One afternoon, Jamal confronted Marcus in the street, his expression tense. "Are you really working with the developers?" he demanded, his voice low but urgent. "Because I've heard things that don't add up." Marcus sighed, aware that Karen's campaign was gaining traction. "Listen to me, Jamal," he said earnestly. "I know Karen's been spreading lies, but you have to trust me. I'm fighting against the developers, not with them. If anyone's trying to sell you out, it's her." Though Jamal nodded reluctantly, Marcus could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. It was becoming clear that Karen's tactics were working, not because they were convincing, but because they preyed on existing anxieties and divisions within the community. Amidst the chaos, an unexpected ally stepped forward. Mrs. Patel, the widow whose home lay directly in the path of the proposed development. Having witnessed Karen's manipulation firsthand, she decided to join forces with Marcus in opposing the project. Together, they organized a coalition of residents determined to resist the encroachment of corporate interests on their neighborhood. Mrs. Patel brought valuable connections to the table, including contacts at local government offices and advocacy groups focused on preserving affordable housing. With her help, Marcus drafted a petition calling for stricter regulations on large-scale developments, emphasizing the need to protect vulnerable communities from displacement. The petition quickly gained momentum, attracting signatures from dozens of residents who had grown weary of Karen's divisiveness and eager to unite around a common cause. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, Marcus felt a genuine sense of solidarity, a shared purpose that transcended personal grievances. As support for the anti-development movement grew, Karen found herself increasingly isolated. Even some of her former allies began distancing themselves, recognizing the damage her actions had caused. One evening, while delivering flyers opposing the project, Marcus encountered Mr. Jenkins, the retired teacher who had once harbored suspicions. "About him, I owe you an apology," Mr. Jenkins admitted sheepishly. "I let Karen plant seeds of doubt in my mind, and I shouldn't have. You're doing good work here, Marcus, and I want to help." Touched by the gesture, Marcus welcomed Mr. Jenkins into the coalition, assigning him tasks to distribute information and engage skeptical neighbors in conversation. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn in their favor, but Karen wasn't done yet. Realizing her attempts to divide the neighborhood weren't yielding the desired results, she turned her attention to undermining Marcus personally. Using her remaining connections on the HOA board, she initiated an investigation into his financial dealings, hoping to uncover evidence of impropriety. When the inquiry produced nothing incriminating, Karen resorted to outright fabrication, circulating false claims about Marcus's involvement with shadowy real estate syndicates. Though most residents dismissed these accusations as baseless, a small minority continued to harbor doubts, ensuring the conflict simmered beneath the surface. As the battle lines hardened, Marcus prepared for what he knew would be the ultimate test of wills. The proposed development loomed large over the neighborhood, threatening not just individual homes, but the very identity of the community itself. And while he believed deeply in the power of collective action, he also recognized the importance of addressing Karen directly, one last time. For months she had operated in the shadows, wielding fear and mistrust as weapons. Now Marcus resolved to bring her into the light, exposing her motivations and forcing her to account for her actions. It wouldn't be easy, but he was ready, because in the end, this wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that justice, integrity, and unity could triumph over prejudice and greed. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a boiling point. With the proposed development threatening to reshape the community forever, Marcus Reed and Karen Thompson stood on opposite sides of an ideological chasm, one that mirrored the growing divide among their neighbors. For Marcus, this was more than just a fight for his home, it was a battle for the soul of the neighborhood. And for Karen, it was her last chance to reclaim control, to prove that her vision of order and exclusivity was the only way forward. Their confrontation would come not in the shadows or behind closed doors, but in full view of the entire community. It was time to settle the score once and for all. The HOA board, recognizing the gravity of the situation, called for an emergency public forum to address the proposed development and its implications for the neighborhood. The meeting would be held in the high school auditorium, chosen for its capacity to accommodate the swelling interest in the issue. Flyers were distributed days in advance, inviting residents to voice their opinions and participate in shaping the future of their community. Karen saw the forum as her opportunity to turn the tide. She spent hours crafting a presentation designed to paint Marcus as a self-serving opportunist and the developers as saviors offering progress and prosperity. Her strategy was simple: appeal to the fears and aspirations of her audience, framing resistance as backward-thinking and counterproductive. Marcus, meanwhile, focused on building momentum for his coalition. He worked tirelessly with Mrs. Patel, Mr. Jenkins, and others to prepare a compelling case against the development, emphasizing its potential to displace families, erode affordability, and destroy the unique character of the neighborhood. They gathered data, testimonials, and expert opinions to bolster their arguments, ensuring every angle was covered. Karen opened the proceedings with characteristic confidence, her polished demeanor masking the desperation bubbling beneath the surface. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying authority, "we stand at a crossroads. The world is changing, and we must change with it, or risk being left behind." She proceeded to outline the benefits of the proposed development, citing projected increases in property values, improved infrastructure, and enhanced amenities. "This isn't about tearing down what we have," she said, gesturing dramatically. "It's about building something better, a brighter future for everyone who calls this place home." Her words struck a chord with some attendees, particularly those newer to the neighborhood or eager for modernization. Applause rippled through the crowd, though it quickly faded as Marcus rose to respond. "Thank you, Karen, for sharing your perspective," Marcus began, his tone measured and respectful. "But I believe there's another side to this story, one that deserves to be heard." He launched into a meticulously prepared rebuttal, dismantling Karen's arguments one by one. Using charts and graphs, he demonstrated how similar developments in other areas had led to skyrocketing rents, displacement of longtime residents, and loss of cultural identity. He shared personal stories from neighbors like Sarah and Jamal, whose lives could be irrevocably altered if the project moved forward. Most powerfully, Marcus highlighted the hypocrisy of Karen's stance. For months, Karen has preached the importance of preserving our neighborhood's standards, he said pointedly. Yet here she stands, endorsing a plan that would fundamentally transform everything we know and love. Which is it, Karen? Are you fighting for tradition or profit? These question hung in the air, forcing many in the audience to confront the contradictions in Karen's rhetoric. Whispers spread through the crowd as people exchanged uneasy glances. Sensing the shift in sentiment, Marcus pressed further, unveiling evidence that left even his staunchest critics speechless. Drawing on documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, he revealed that Karen had secretly corresponded with representatives of the development company, suggesting ways to expedite the approval process. Though these communications stopped short of outright collusion, they cast serious doubt on her impartiality. "I don't bring this up to attack Karen personally," Marcus concluded, his voice steady. "I bring it up because transparency matters. If we're going to make decisions that affect our entire community, we need to do so based on facts, not spin, not manipulation, and certainly not hidden agendas." The revelation sent shockwaves through the auditorium. Even longtime supporters of Karen looked visibly shaken, their trust in her shaken to its core. When she attempted to defend herself, her explanations fell flat, undermined by the mounting evidence against her. A moment of unity as the forum drew to a close. Robert, the HOA president, stepped forward to summarize the discussion. "We've heard passionate arguments on both sides tonight," he said gravely. "And while I can't pretend to speak for everyone, I think it's clear that this decision requires careful consideration and input from all stakeholders." He then announced plans to form a task force composed of residents representing diverse perspectives, tasked with evaluating the development proposal and recommending a course of action. Marcus and Karen would both serve on the committee alongside Mrs. Patel, Mr. Jenkins, and several others. Though the move represented a compromise, it also marked a significant victory for Marcus. By ensuring multiple voices were included in the decision-making process, he had effectively neutralized Karen's ability to manipulate the outcome unilaterally. More importantly, he had fostered a sense of collaboration where division once reigned. In the days following the forum, the mood in the neighborhood shifted perceptibly. Conversations between neighbors became less tense, more constructive. People who had previously avoided each other now found common ground in their desire to protect their homes and way of life. Karen, however, remained defiant. Though her influence had waned significantly, she continued to sow discord wherever possible, clinging to the belief that if she waited long enough, cracks would reappear. But Marcus wasn't worried. He knew the tide had turned decisively in his favor. As he walked home late one evening, passing familiar houses bathed in soft twilight, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. This wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that justice, integrity, and unity could triumph over fear and greed. And as the final chapter approached, he braced himself for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing one thing for certain: the neighborhood would never be the same again. The task force convened for the first time in the community center, its members seated around a long table under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Marcus Reed sat at one end, his posture relaxed but alert, while Karen Thompson occupied the opposite side, her expression tight with barely contained hostility. Between them were representatives from various factions of the neighborhood: Mrs. Patel, Mr. Jenkins, Sarah, Jamal, and others, all united by a shared commitment to shaping the future of their community. Robert, the HOA president, stood at the head of the table, his voice steady as he opened the meeting. "We're here today to evaluate the proposed development," he began, "and determine whether it aligns with the values and needs of our neighborhood. This won't be easy, but I believe we can reach a consensus if we approach this process with honesty and respect." His words carried weight, setting the tone for what promised to be a contentious yet crucial discussion. As the session unfolded, it became clear that the task force would serve not just as a decision-making body, but as a crucible for testing the strength of the newfound unity Marcus had helped foster. Breaking down barriers. Karen wasted no time asserting her position, arguing forcefully in favor of the development. She cited economic benefits, promising infrastructure improvements, and the allure of modern amenities. Her arguments were polished, rehearsed, and delivered with practiced conviction. But this time they faced stiffer resistance, not just from Marcus, but from several other members of the group who had grown increasingly skeptical of her motives. Mrs. Patel, speaking up for the first time, addressed Karen directly. "You talk about progress, Karen," she said calmly, "but whose progress are you really talking about? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the people benefiting most from this project aren't the ones living here now." Her words struck a chord, prompting nods of agreement from around the table. Even some of Karen's former allies began to question her assertions, recognizing the disconnect between her rhetoric and the realities faced by longtime residents. Marcus seized the opportunity to reinforce these doubts, drawing on data collected. During the forum preparation, he presented a comprehensive analysis of the potential consequences of the development. He highlighted projections showing increased property taxes, reduced affordability, and displacement risks for vulnerable families. Each point was supported by evidence, leaving little room for counter-argument. When Karen attempted to dismiss his findings as exaggerated or irrelevant, Marcus countered with personal anecdotes from neighbors whose lives could be directly impacted. "This isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet," he emphasized. "It's people like Sarah, like Jamal, like Mrs. Patel. If we approve this project without considering their needs, we're failing them and ourselves. Finding common ground as the meeting progressed, an unexpected dynamic emerged. Rather than devolving into partisan bickering, the conversation began to focus on solutions. Members of the task force started brainstorming ways to mitigate the negative effects of the development while preserving its potential benefits. Ideas ranged from negotiating stricter zoning regulations to securing guarantees for affordable housing units. Even Karen seemed momentarily caught off guard by this shift, her usual combative stance softening slightly as she grappled with the possibility of compromise. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider alternatives beyond outright approval or rejection. Though her participation remained guarded, it signaled a willingness to engage more constructively, a small but significant victory for Marcus and his allies. By the end of the session, the group had agreed on several key principles to guide their evaluation of the proposal. These included prioritizing resident input, ensuring transparency throughout the decision-making process, and exploring options for minimizing adverse impacts on the community. While far from resolved, these commitments laid the groundwork for meaningful collaboration moving forward. Over the following weeks, the task force conducted extensive research, held additional meetings, and solicited feedback from residents through surveys and town hall discussions. The results painted a clear picture. The majority of the neighborhood opposed the development as currently proposed, citing concerns about affordability, displacement, and loss of character. Armed with this consensus, the task force drafted a formal recommendation to the HOA board, urging them to reject the project unless substantial revisions were made. Specifically, they called for limits on density, protections for existing homeowners, and measures to ensure the preservation of green spaces and communal areas. When the final vote took place, the outcome was decisive. The board unanimously adopted the task force's recommendations, effectively halting the development until the developers agreed to address the outlined issues. It was a landmark decision, one that reflected the growing power of collective action within the neighborhood. In the aftermath of the victory, a palpable sense of relief washed over the community. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now exchanged smiles and waves, their shared triumph bridging old divides. Marcus watched this transformation unfold with quiet satisfaction, knowing he had played a role in fostering it, but also recognizing that the credit belonged to everyone who had stood together against adversity. Karen, however, refused to accept defeat gracefully. Though marginalized by the decision, she continued to harbor resentment toward Marcus and those who had opposed her. In private moments, she muttered darkly about revenge, vowing to rebuild her influence and reclaim her position as the neighborhood's unofficial leader. But for now, her threats carried little weight. The community had moved past her, choosing instead to embrace a brighter, more inclusive vision of its future. Months later, Marcus finalized plans for the community center he had envisioned since purchasing the second property. With funding secured through grants and donations, construction began on a facility designed to serve as a hub for education, recreation, and social connection. Local artists contributed murals depicting the neighborhood's history and diversity, while volunteers worked tirelessly to transform the space into a welcoming environment for all. On opening day, residents gathered in celebration, their laughter echoing through the newly renovated building. Children played in the after-school program rooms, teenagers practiced basketball in the gymnasium, and seniors attended workshops teaching digital literacy skills. For many, it was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of division and conflict, positive change was possible. As Marcus stood among the crowd watching the joyous scene unfold, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about winning. It was about creating something lasting, something meaningful. And though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, he knew the foundation had been laid for the neighborhood and for himself, because sometimes standing up to injustice doesn't just change the world around you, it changes you too. And so the story of Marcus Reed and Karen Thompson came full circle, not with vengeance or destruction, but with growth, resilience, and renewal.